Anyways, we're in the middle of a series called Campfire. And really what the series is designed to do is to give the speakers an opportunity to share a little bit about what God's been doing in their life, talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on personally, and then share it with you. One of the things that I love about summer, one of the things that I think has, Lorraine, you're awesome. One of the things that I've always appreciated and loved about the summer is some of the freedom, we get to take a step back. I think part of it goes back to the early days when we're kids, where maybe not everyone was like this, but I know I anticipated from September 8th on summer, because of not having to do school, the chores seemed to disappear a little bit, and just some of the freedom to kind of be, just to maybe take a step back for some of the responsibilities. And I think as I've grown into my adult years, some of that has stuck with me. I love summer because I get to take a step back. Maybe my focus isn't quite as much on kind of driving an agenda forward and getting just to hang out, to have conversations around a campfire. Poof, look at that. Oh, I'm going to help this one little poor flame out. I'm the guy who always has to play with the fire, if you can ask my wife. So if it's not quite working, then I have to mess with it. And, is that maybe there? Oh, yes. Success. I built a fire. And I always find something really cool about a fire. It's disarming. I've had some of the greatest conversations of my life, whether it be at a camp or in a campsite or out in the bush somewhere, sitting around a campfire, just talking about who I am, what's going on in my life, and some of those kinds of things. And that's really what I want to do with you today. My title, or what I've kind of envisioned as we go forward, is asking the question, what are you doing here? I've alluded to it on a number of occasions as I've spoken at different times here, that sometimes I can be a little bit directionally challenged. I seem to have the ability from time to time to get myself turned around, to get myself lost, even though I'm a person who prides myself in really having a pretty good game plan, a pretty good focus, a pretty good idea of where I want to head. Yet there seems to be times in my life where I get turned around and I'm not exactly sure how to get back. So what I want to do for you this morning is take you back and kind of share a little bit about who I am, I wouldn't say who I was, but kind of take you through some of my life. It's kind of weird this morning because as I look across the crowd, there's a pretty good cross-section of the last probably 20 years of my life, people here. Maybe you don't know all of the different pieces and know them all together, but that's what I'm hoping to share with you this morning. My life started off, as all of you did, with being born. That's nothing new for, I think, anybody. I grew up in a pretty normal family. Both my parents were believers. We were regular attenders at church, and fairly early on, I felt the call to ministry. Probably grade 7, grade 8, there was a number of things that transpired in my life, and I began to feel like God was calling me towards full-time ministry. A whole pile of different things kind of took place over the course of the next number of years, and I found myself at grade 12, after graduating, heading off to a place called Canadian Bible College. And I spent the next 3 years of my life there, or school years, kind of digging in, finding out more about this person that I said I was following for the rest of my life. I began to develop and I began to understand who I was and maybe what God had created me to be. And began to find out where my strengths were and where some of the things that I think God had gifted me to do and to be. Within short order, in my last part of my third year, there was this girl that caught my attention named Ruth, and all of a sudden, love blossomed, and all of a sudden, this girl who was just a friend became something so much more to me. And as we began to talk and dream and plan, ministry was a major focus of that. It was something that she had felt from a very young age as well, and I'm like, this is a match made in heaven. This is going to be awesome. So after my third year of school, went back home to Surrey, got involved in our youth group there as a leader, worked pretty closely with my youth pastor there over the next couple of years, and actually got to dig in, put some of the stuff that I was learning at school together, and got even more excited about this call that God had placed on my life. After a few years, got married, went back for my final year, did internship, which means I spent 3 months in a church, kind of again before jumping in full-fledged. And at the end of it all, knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God called me to ministry. Fast forward. That would have been 19. Wow, I don't want to say that. It actually does realistically 97. Yes, thanks, hon. Many of you in this weren't even born yet when this was taking place. But 1997, I graduated and within short order started my first church in Rocky Mountain House. Learned a ridiculous amount in those first couple of years. A lot of things that I would never do again, and a lot of things that I would continue to do again throughout my ministry years. Shortly, I shouldn't say shortly, after spending about 6 years in Rocky Mountain House, we got a call, and we knew our time was done there. And all of a sudden, this place called Cranbrook popped up on our radar screen. We went through an interview process with the church here in town, and felt like this was the next place that God was leading us to. So we moved to Cranbrook. I think we'd driven through it 3 or 4 times over my life. I know Ruth had never been here before. And we felt like we had, in some senses, arrived. We were part of a church that was active, that was growing. I got to be part of a youth ministry that I got to sort of really begin to dig in. I was working with some pretty amazing students. Some of you guys are actually here in the auditorium right now. Katie was one of my cheerleaders. I'm not sure what you would call. Katie, what did you repeatedly call me that I was always embarrassed about?
Either Scotty Dog or Scotty
Yes.
Potty.
Yeah, I had 2 Facebook groups by 2 different students. And this is not about self-promotion or saying, look how good I was. But it was a place that I felt like I belonged. I was in the middle of something that God was using. God was doing some really cool things. We'd set up a process that, because when we arrived, we were really good at having adult leaders, but there really wasn't a lot of development with our kids. And over the 8 years that we were within that ministry, we really saw that there was a need for development within kids, that we wanted our kids, once they graduated, to be so active and involved that for them to leave their youth group and not be involved in big church or whatever you wanted to call it would just be strange and weird. So we went about developing this really cool thing that we saw leaders develop. And I felt like at that moment in time, I had found my sweet spot. I found my place. I knew God was doing some really cool things. We saw kids going off, not just into ministry, which that happened, but saw kids graduate with a real solid understanding of their faith and went on to other types of careers and were digging in and being really cool examples of how God wanted to use people. All along, I preached and spoke and taught that you need to be faithful with what God gave you, using the gifts, using the abilities, using the things that He had basically put in you, and letting Him work through those things. We just sang a song, says, "Where you go, I will follow, through the dark and the narrow." And I was one of those people that would have been on board singing at the top of my lungs with that. But sometimes you don't know what that kind of singing means or what kind of praying those kinds of results actually happen. After being in the church for about 7 years or so, I began to sense within myself that, you know what? This is maybe not the fit that I want. And it wasn't that the church was doing anything wrong or that I was doing anything wrong, But I know God was taking me in a slightly different direction, that the way the church was orientated and the way God was leading me was shifting. And truthfully, I didn't know what to do with that. That was a hard thing for me because I loved this church. I loved these people. I loved what I was getting to be a part of on a day-to-day basis. But suddenly, things just didn't seem to be quite right anymore. After having some conversations with some leaders and some people I really trusted, the suggestion was that maybe this is not a good fit for you, and maybe it's time for you to begin to step down and begin to look in a different direction. And that was hard because this was family. These were a group of people I loved, and I didn't know how to explain what was going on inside me and where God was directing me in such a way that I could do that in a positive way. But you know what? God had been faithful with us in the past. He'd always been there. He'd always provided. And we jumped into that new adventure, at the time anyways, for me, with a fair bit of confidence. I was tired. I needed a break and all those kinds of things. But I had a pretty good idea that things were going to go according to plan. And see, my plan at that time was I was going to spend sort of between, 10 years or so with youth ministry, then begin to move into more of a senior leadership role. I figured by the time I was 45, 46, I'd be a senior leader in a church somewhere. And that was my game plan. That was what I was aiming for. That's what I believed that God was calling me to. Going into that interim period after we stepped down from the church, suddenly things felt like they began to fall apart for me anyways. Up until that point in time, typically I got anywhere from 3 to 4 phone calls a year from churches saying, "Hey Scott, we like what we hear about what you're doing in Cranbrook. Would you consider maybe coming our way?" And at the time, I really felt that God hadn't released us from Cranbrook, or Ruth and I both talked about that on a fairly regular basis. But you know what? There was some pride going, "Yep, they want me. I'm okay. If this doesn't work out, I've got a backup plan because there's other churches out there that are interested in the amazing Scott Peters." We stepped down. 3 months later, there were no phone calls. Started to worry a little bit, but you know what? God would prevail, and God would come through for us. Month 6, still no phone calls. And Scott's starting to panic. He's starting to worry. He's not feeling nearly as confident in his God as he did 6 months earlier, when everything seemed to be rolling out according to Scott's plan. Nothing had changed. My personality hadn't changed. I didn't become a different person, other than I followed, or we as a family followed, where God was leading us. So that continues on. And as every week went by and every morning I got up and showered, I remember thinking to myself, "What are you doing here? What's going on? Why are you in this place, Scott?" And then that negative cycle that so many of us probably have found themselves in, you begin to doubt, you begin to blame, you begin to, "God, what are you doing to me? How come? I trusted you. You told me you were going to take me someplace. And now I'm here sitting in my shower, completely fallen apart." The confidence that I once had, the belief that I was a leader, the belief that I was a mentor, the belief that I could do this from the highs of June, and now it's December, and struggling just to get up every day. During that time, we started attending this church. And it was an exciting church. It was a church that was pretty cool. It was fun to see some of the people that I had worked with over the years. But at the same time, part of me was, every time I came to church and saw what was going up on stage, I'm like, "Yeah, Scott, obviously you failed somewhere along the line. Because that used to be you, and now you're there." And that was a struggle that I was going through. It has nothing to do with pastors versus congregation. But in my mind, this was, in some senses, where I thought God had led me to. He'd called me to ministry, hadn't he? And life did not necessarily get easier from there. We had been in the church a couple of years, and Ruth started having some health problems, and all of a sudden, out comes this C word. Great, God, haven't you done enough? Haven't you put our family through enough? We are struggling here. I'm losing it. I'm hoping that my wife at least can be kind of strong, because I didn't have it all together like I once did. And now she's going through breast cancer. And again, the question's constantly coming up. What are you doing? What are you doing here? So often, I think we go into life thinking that it's all laid out, that it's all planned out, and we base our decisions and our goals and our emotions and all that kind of stuff revolves around us knowing the plan. And I would say the last 5-6 years of my life really has been unlearning some of those kinds of things. I take solace in knowing that I'm not the only one who feels this way or who has felt this way. I'm not the only one who's felt lost, even though they knew exactly where they were. I'm not the only one who asks, what am I doing here? And how did I get here? And it was in these moments and these times that some of the passages of Scripture that I read through school and as a kid, and I'd memorized and just delved into, started to come back to me. And one of the people that I look to, and one of my heroes, has always been a guy named Elijah. Elijah was a guy who lived in a pretty rough period of Israel's history. You can find his story in 1 Kings in the Old Testament. Elijah's day job was being a prophet for God. And in those days, the role of a prophet was really, in many cases, to speak to leadership of the country and let them know what God was thinking, what God's plans were, where they were doing well and where they maybe weren't doing so well. And Elijah had the great privilege of working in a time where Israel was not working well. The land was full of foreign gods. The kings and the queen of the day, Ahab and Jezebel, were full-on worshiping a foreign god. And Elijah had the responsibility of going before them and saying, guys, you need to turn around, or there's some serious things coming along from God. So Elijah gets the word from God, and he needs to go talk to the king and queen and basically give them the news that because of the choices they've made and because of the direction Israel is headed, there's going to be a famine or a drought that's going to take place for the next 3 years. Now, I don't know if anybody can imagine what that must have felt like. Again, this is not a democracy. The king and the queen had the ability to end people's lives, and this was Elijah's job to go. So he goes, faithfully delivers the message, and then basically God takes him out of the situation and hides him away for 3 years. During that time, Elijah had some pretty miraculous things take place in his life. He lived by a brook in the middle of a drought and was fed by ravens. I know, kind of a little weird. I can't imagine how many of us be excited about having our daily meal being brought by a bird. But God provided for Elijah in some pretty amazing ways while he was there. A little bit later on, as the drought continued, that brook dried up, and God called him to move into a different area, and he moved in with a very, very poor widow who really didn't have the means to support this prophet. But in that culture, when the prophet showed up, the expectation was you took care of him. And over the next 2 years as he lived there, God miraculously provided food. And what happened was, and if you again, I don't want to take the time to jump in the whole story, but there was essentially a jar of oil and a container of flour that for 2 years never ran out. it continued day after day, week after week, month after month, as that widow went to provide food for the prophet and her family. God was faithful. And Elijah saw some really cool things happen there. This widow's son got sick and died. And Elijah cried out to God, laid upon this child, and he returned from the dead. 3 years later, Elijah's getting called back into the limelight. He's been kind of off the radar, laying a little bit low, and God tells him, you know what, Elijah, it's time that the drought ends. It's time, in a sense, for a showdown. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Elijah, but essentially he goes and tells the king, it's time for a showdown. Meet me on Mount Carmel. Bring all of your prophets of Baal, and we're going to decide who really is the God of Israel. So essentially the test was that there was going to be a sacrifice, an offering that was laid on an altar in the middle. And essentially what is whichever God lit and burnt that sacrifice, that was the God. So the 400 prophets did all sorts of things. They danced, they cut themselves, they did, you named it, cried out to their God, and nothing happened. And I don't know how long that went on. There's some times in here, but I won't bore you with that. But essentially, all along, Elijah was praying to his God, going, God, please show up. Please show up. Prove yourself to our people that you are who you say you are. And of course, I'm sure he was praying at the same time, please don't let Baal show up. Please don't let that start, because I don't know what I'm going to do if that happens. After that takes place, he's given them their time. He's mocked them. He's even suggested in there that maybe their God is busy and he's in the bathroom, and that's why he can't come and help them. There's all sorts of fun things that he was a bit of a cocky guy, I think, at times. Maybe confident is a better word. So when it's Elijah's turn, God's got a bit of a game plan that I'm sure he wasn't necessarily super stoked about either. So instead of just leaving things as was, he instructed some of his servants to dig a trench around this altar and then go get some water. And he proceeded to dump gallon after gallon after gallon of water over this sacrifice, making it that much more difficult. Yet when it came time for Elijah to pray, God, prove who you are, it was boom, instant fire. And it wasn't just that the sacrifice sort of poof, lit on fire like this. It was instantly gone. Everything. The animal, the wood, the rocks, the water. It was this just, I can imagine this charred crater. And at that moment in time, I can just imagine how Elijah felt. He's in the middle of his wheelhouse. He's a prophet of God going, you know what, this is the best day ever. Right? Like, who wouldn't? Look what God just did. And I can almost imagine in his head him going, you know what, this is going to turn everything around. This day is going to mark where God grabs a hold of this nation and we start plowing forward in incredible ways. So a little bit more to the story, just to show how God was involved in Elijah's life. He now prays for the drought to end, and way off in the distance, he sees this little cloud. First cloud in 3 years, probably, that anyone's seen. And he tells the servant, head back to the king, let him know that the rain is coming, and you better hurry, because the storm is going to be fierce, and if you get caught in it, you're not going to make it. So off he goes, and I'm not sure exactly why, but at some point in time, Elijah kind of figures out, I don't think he's going to make it. Guess what? I'm going to make a beeline. So God gives him superhuman strength. I'm not sure, Flash? Sorry, Marvel. And start a war here. No. He picks up his robes, tucks them in, and goes for a run and passes the chariot. Goes before the king, lets them know what's happening. The drought is over. God has provided. He's going to restore the nation. And he gets news that he's not being welcomed back. Jezebel, the queen, says, you're dead. You are dead. And I can just imagine what was going through Elijah's mind at that moment in time. He saw glory. He saw riding off into the sunset as Israel follows what God's path was for them. And then this story, you are not going to make it past tomorrow. And Elijah takes off running once again. But this time it's not in victory, it's in defeat. He makes it out of the city and runs for a while and then just finds himself under a tree, exhausted, depressed. And God comes alongside him and comforts him. He sends an angel. An angel feeds him, says, get up, there's more to life than this. God will provide. He's going to take care of you. Feeds him, and then he proceeds to travel another 40 days on that meal. And then we pick up the story where I want to read for us this morning in chapter 19, the second half of the verse, or the second half of the chapter. And it says this. So now we've, just to give you a little bit more, he's now sitting in a cave, alone, afraid, defeated, not knowing where to go next. And then it says this. So the Lord came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I've zealously served the Lord Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. They've torn down your altars, and they've killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And then he said to Elijah, the Lord told him, go out and stand before me on the mountain. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain, and it was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake either. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire either. After the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And the voice said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Yet again. And he replied again, I have zealously served the Lord Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken your covenant with you. They've torn down your altars, and they've killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. You can hear the pain, you can hear the suffering, you can hear the loss in his response. In many cases, I think for him, his dreams of what he saw happening in Israel, in his mind, were dead and gone. For some of us here, we may be awfully tempted to begin to think, how after God has showed up in such miraculous ways in the life of Elijah, could he possibly be here? Right? How many of you guys have ever felt that way about watching someone maybe you knew that was strong in the faith, going, how on earth could they be so stupid to be there? What are you doing here? And I think some of us, and I know myself, have been there before as I've looked at the story of Elijah, going, you know what, Elijah, you were fed by ravens, you were fed by miraculous means of unending flour and oil, you raised a kid from the dead, you outraced a chariot, like all of these things that God was faithful in and miraculous in and strong in. And yet, here he is, afraid, alone, and by himself. I kind of wish I knew, or I could have been there to watch, because I think I could have learned some things. That was Elijah's perspective, but let's just read a little bit further on and kind of hear God's perspective and what God was seeing, because Elijah was seeing it from his point of view. My dream is dead, it's all gone, it's never going to be good again, and I'm in trouble. Oh no, it's better just to fade off and die at this particular point in time. But here's God's side of the story in verse 15. It says this, then the Lord told him, go back the way you came. Travel to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive there, anoint Hazael, the king of Aram, and anoint Jehu, grandson of Nimshi, to be the king of Israel. anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel, oh boy, this is a terrible, Mehoah. I'm sorry, James, you're going to crucify me later on the pronunciation of that one. To replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and anyone who escapes Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve for you 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal or kissed him. You see, God had a plan that Elijah, in the moment of fear and frustration, in worry and in doubt, didn't know about. He jetted because all he saw was what was right in front of him. Regardless of what had happened in the past, he saw the circumstances in the here and now and said, you know what, it's over. All these dreams, all these expectations, all the things that I thought God was leading to me are now gone because of what I see here and now. And God's gentle reminder was, you know what? I have something else for you. It may not be exactly what you thought you were getting yourself into or what you dreamed about, but you have purpose, I have plans for you, and you matter. So I wanted to break down and sort of talk about a couple of things that I know I got wrong, and I think Elijah also got wrong. The first was that the way he operated, the way he saw himself. And I know this is a flaw and something that I oftentimes find myself in the middle of. He often chose to work alone, and as a result, often felt isolation and loneliness. See, he operated on his own, and when those moments of doubt came along, there was no one to back him up. There was no one to help him to see that there was maybe something better. And I know for myself, in those dark times, I tend to go inside. I tend to push people away, saying, you know what, I don't want to bother you with my stuff. I'll take care of me. I'm independent. And I think that was the same fault that Elijah did. I think Elijah also forgot how God operated, that God more often whispers than he shouts. He became so used to seeing these incredible, miraculous moves of God that he began to assume that's always the way God communicated. That it was always in these huge victories. It was always in these highlight moments. It was always in these moments where God was just, wah. And then things go sideways, and he's like, okay, God, where's the wah? But he wasn't in that fire. He wasn't in that wind. He wasn't in the earthquake. He was in the gentle whisper. He needed to stop. He needed to slow down. He needed to take a deep breath and listen. And I think Elijah also forgot where his place was. Elijah prided himself in knowing where God was going and where he was supposed to be, but in the midst of that, he, like me, forgot his place. He forgot that God gets to direct the story, not him. I forgot that God gets to direct the story, not me. What are the first couple of acts that God asks Elijah to do as he's being asked to return back to public after pulling away? Anoint 2 kings and anoint his successor. What does that mean? I think it was probably to some extent a bit of an ego crush. Okay, Elijah, you're not ruling this world. I've got 2 kings in store that are going to take care of things, and guess what? You're not indispensable. You're actually anointing your successor, the person you're going to be replaced by. I know for me, those kinds of words are tough. What, God? The world doesn't revolve around me, and you don't need me? But he does, and he did. You see, Elijah was uniquely gifted in the time that he was in and the place that he found himself. He just forgot. God used him to anoint kings and guide and direct them for years. He anointed Elisha, who became a prophet after him, went on to do even bigger and better things in the world of Israel. And he got to be a part of that. But initially, it wasn't in his game plan. It wasn't in his life. It wasn't what he expected because he had it all mapped out. So where do we go from here? I can't say that I've got my life completely figured out. It's now 7 years after, essentially around this time, that we stepped down from ministry. I've yet to get a phone call. Not asking for one, don't. But it's been a struggle for me in my life to figure, okay, now what does that mean? What am I doing here? And I think that question for us, as I want us to walk away and begin to think, that question can be asked in two different ways. And it was asked of me and continues to be asked of me in two different ways. First of all, what are you doing here? And what I mean by that is, as in, you are lost right now, and where you currently are, you do not belong. And that was God's words to me. Scott, you are lost right now, and you do not belong here. You do not belong confused. You do not belong hurt. You do not belong feeling like you have no purpose and no goal, and you do not matter in my plan. You don't belong here. That's not who you are. So for some of us today, that's maybe where you are. That life is not headed in the direction that you thought it would be. And you're sitting in a cave somewhere, maybe not literally because you're here, but figuratively in your mind in a cave going, God, take me now, please, because I just don't see my way clear of this. Hear from me and hear from the story of Elijah that if that's where you are, that is not where you belong. And it's time to come home, to start coming back to the place that God has for you. The other way to ask that question is, what are you doing here? And this is the question is, so you're not lost anymore. What are you going to do now that you're here? And that's been the struggle for me as I grew up in my last 20 plus years, we're thinking full-time ministry. I was going to be a pastor for the rest of my life. And now I'm 7 years in, and I'm having to think through, okay, God, what are you doing with my life? This seems to be the path you're taking me on. It's not the one I thought of. It's not the one I dreamed of. It's not the one I planned early in my life. But here you are. I'm yours. I've sung over and over and over again, where you lead or where you go, I will follow. So now it's, what do I do with the skill sets I've been given, with the life experience I have? How do I use that to God's glory while still fully embracing who he created me to be? And to begin with, what I used to tell myself, well, Scott, you may not get paid to be a pastor, but that's who you are. And at the beginning, I thought to myself, yeah, Scott, quit lying to yourself. That's just a cop-out. You really aren't. But as I've begun to think and begin to pray and begin to grow and begin to look at my life and what God has gifted me to do, I more fully believe that God has me exactly where he always wanted me to be. No, it's not my plan. It's not what I thought I would be doing at this particular point in time. It wasn't part of my 10-year plan. Yet God has gifted me in such a way for such a time as this. And maybe all of this all happened for this particular day so I could tell this particular story for someone here in this room. To say that, you know what, just because your goals and your plans didn't work out according to plan doesn't mean that God has left you behind, that he hasn't gone on to greener pastures. He's calling you today and asking you, what are you doing here? How are you going to use the gifts, the abilities, the talents, the skills that he has placed in you to make a difference in someone's life? See, I've learned I don't have to have the pastor of, as it says in my Bible, Reverend Scott Peters, to make a difference in someone's life. to be able to share the gospel, to be able to tell my story, be able to show what God is doing. That's just really, it's a title. It's not who I am. God has created me to be someone that loves others and shows that way to Christ. It's been a hard lesson to learn. It's been a painful lesson to learn. And hopefully you guys don't have to go through that. I don't share this story lightly. I've avoided sharing this for the last 7 years because it's been a real struggle to kind of reshape and rethink about who Scott Peters is. But I'm excited about this next phase. I'm excited about what God will continue to do through me and ultimately what he's going to do through us as a church. That's the end of my camp story.